The Second Amendment reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." However, on the wall of the NRA's headquarters in Fairfax, Virginia, the first half of this amendment is nowhere to be seen. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed adorns the walls of the NRA and is used as the rallying cry for gun rights activists across the country. This Second Amendment right is often construed to mean that each and every American citizen has the individual right to keep and bear arms, but that is a relatively new constitutional interpretation. From the time law reviews were first cataloged through 1959, every law review upheld a collective rights view of the Second Amendment, meaning that it specifically did not grant individuals the right to own a gun, but rather gave American citizens as a whole the right to keep and bear arms for the point of maintaining a well-regulated militia. The Supreme Court refused to rule the Second Amendment guaranteed an individual right outside the context of a militia on 4 separate occasions between 1876 and 1939. Additionally, when the Supreme Court addressed this issue in 1939, with the United States v. Miller case, a collected rights view was officially adopted. This case was in regard to a sawed-off shotgun, and the court ruled there was insufficient evidence to suggest that the shotgun has some reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia. The first law review to express support for an individual rights perspective was published in 1960 and cited an article from the NRA's American Rifleman magazine. Following this publication, the NRA hosted an essay competition and donated $1 million to the George Mason University Law School to endow the Patrick Henry Professorship in Constitutional Law and the Second Amendment to foster the authorship of articles supporting their individual rights agenda. To this day, NRA members can donate $10,000 to be considered a Patrick Henry member. The Supreme Court's decision in United States v. Miller held for almost 70 years until 2008, when the court first adopted an individual rights interpretation of the Second Amendment in District of Columbia v. Heller. The decision in District of Columbia v. Heller was made with a 5-4 majority, with all 5 of the justices in the majority being nominated by presidents who were members of the NRA. Historian and Pulitzer Prize winner Jack Rakove pointed out that if Americans had indeed been concerned with the impact of the Constitution on this right, the proponents of individual rights theory would not have to recycle the same handful of references or to rip promising snippets of quotations from the text and speeches in which they are embedded. Essentially, there is very little merit to the individual rights theory. The same arguments for this constitutional interpretation are repeated without context or substantiation. The Founding Fathers actually had very little to say about the Second Amendment, and it wasn't a topic of popular debate until the second half of the 20th century, with the help of the NRA and their generous monetary contributions to the cause. From 2012 to 2016, the United States averaged 35,141 gun deaths per year, with an average of 12,726 of those being homicides. This chart shows the breakdown of gun violence by intent. Suicides make up the highest percentage of gun deaths with 61.6%, and homicides take second place with 36.2%. While gun violence as a whole is a significant problem, the amount of mass shootings in America is especially startling. A 2016 study conducted showed that while the United States had about 5% of the world's population, it had 31% of all public mass shootings. The United States' disproportionate contribution to the mass shooting phenomenon warrants a more in-depth examination of the underlying influences. There are 2 common definitions of a mass shooting. The Gun Violence Archive defines a mass shooting as any incident in which a gunman shoots or kills 4 or more people in the same general time and location. Using this definition, there were 307 mass shootings from January through November of 2017. The Congressional Research Service defines a mass shooting as any incident in which a gunman kills 4 or more people, selects victims randomly, and attacks in a public place. Using this definition, there were 10 mass shootings during the same time period. If the gunman commits suicide following the incident, they are not included in the death count in either definition. The most significant difference is the requirement for people to have died for an incident to be considered a mass shooting. Despite the fact that people are shot, many incidents of gun violence go unpublicized because the gunshots were not fatal. This graph showcases the difference between injuries and deaths in shootings over the years. Of the 34 deadliest shootings from 1949 to present, 17 have occurred within the last 10 years. Half of America's deadliest shootings happened over the 69 years from 1949 to 2008, and the second half occurred throughout the last 10 years. Coincidentally or not, the court supported an individual rights view of the Second Amendment for the first time 10 years ago. Furthermore, half of the 10 deadliest shootings and 4 of the 5 deadliest shootings took place after the District of Columbia v. Heller ruling. From 1949 through the District of Columbia v. Heller ruling, on average, one of the deadliest mass shootings occurred every 3.5 years, with an average of 13.59 people killed per shooting, not including the shooter. From the District of Columbia v. Heller ruling through the present, on average, one of the deadliest mass shootings occurred every 7 months, with an average of 17.65 people killed per shooting, not including the shooter. This suggests that mass shootings have increased in both frequency and number of casualties.
According to the Congressional Research Service, there are roughly twice as many guns per capita in the United States as there were in 1968, more than 300 million guns in all. Gun sales have increased in recent years. According to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, U.S. gun makers produced nearly 11 million guns in 2013, the year after the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre. That's twice as many as they made in 2010. As of 2015, there are more guns than people in the United States. While some believe that guns provide protection for American citizens, research has said otherwise. Although burglary and theft rates in the U.S. are similar to those in other developed countries, the rate of criminal homicide is 4 to 14 times higher in the U.S. than it is in other Western industrialized nations. In a comparative study using data from 1992, London had about 20,000 more burglaries and robberies than New York City. However, only 7 people were killed during one of those incidents in London, while 378 people were killed during such crimes in New York. But not all killings in America are rooted in criminal activity. In 1992, arguments resulted in 32% of American homicides, while felonies and suspected felonies only accounted for 16%. Guns are used in 70% of all U.S. killings, but only in 4% of all crimes. So why is this an American issue? Well, a large number of Americans tie their personal freedom to their ability to bear arms, whether it be related to hunting, sport shooting, or personal protection. Exposure to guns in America is highly prevalent. 48% of people grew up in a household with guns, 59% of people say at least some of their friends own guns, and 72% have shot a gun, despite 55% of those people never having personally owned one. Today, 3 in 10 American adults say they own a gun, and an additional 36% say that while they may not own one now, they might be open to owning a gun in the future. Only a third of adults say they don't currently own a gun and cannot see themselves ever owning one. Although a large number of individuals own or are open to owning a gun, a large number of gun experiences are not positive. 44% of adults say they personally know someone who has been shot either accidentally or intentionally, and 23% say they or someone in their family have been threatened or intimidated by someone using a gun. 66% of gun owners own multiple firearms, and about 73% say they could never see themselves not owning a gun. 49% of all gun owners say that all or most of their friends own guns. Opposingly, among those who don't own a gun, only 1 in 10 say that all or most of their friends own guns. Men who grew up in a household with guns and who have ever shot a gun report that they first fired a gun when they were on average 12 years old. Among women who grew up in a gun-owning household and who have ever shot a gun, the average age at which they first fired a gun is 17. On average, men become gun owners at 19 and women become gun owners at 27 years old. Despite having distinct views on gun legislation, there is one defining characteristic of gun owners, and that is that 74% of gun owners say their right to own guns is essential to their own personal sense of freedom. The U.S. is one of the 3 countries in the world where the right to own a gun is protected by the Constitution. In other nations, mass shootings have caused comprehensive reform for gun laws, while in America, gun reform has remained relatively stagnant, while people have become desensitized to constant mass shootings. For example, after 16 were murdered in a mass shooting in 2002, German legislators passed a law that restricted the use of large-caliber weapons and strengthened rules on the safe storage of weapons. 7 years later, 15 people were murdered in another mass shooting, and again, Germany quickly pushed an amendment to the Weapons Act passed in 2002 that created a federal arms registry and further tightened the regulation of firearm storage. Similar patterns of action were present in other developed nations like Britain and Australia. What sets the United States apart, though, is that the NRA is unparalleled in its caliber of influence on gun regulation and reform and America's political arena. Federal laws require licensed gun dealers to run background checks before allowing someone to purchase a gun. However, due to a provision the NRA supported and pushed in 1993 to be added to the Brady Bill, sales can proceed after 3 business days regardless of whether or not someone's background check has been cleared. While the background check system has stopped 2.4 million guns from being sold to dangerous citizens, gun dealers have moved forward with over 15,000 gun sales to people who are prohibited to own guns. While 15,000 may seem small in comparison to 2.4 million, it only takes one sale to a dangerous person to heavily impact our society. One of those 15,000 guns sold to prohibited citizen was given to the perpetrator of the 2015 Charleston mass shooting, where 9 people died in their place of worship. Almost a decade later, the NRA worked closely with a Republican state legislator from Florida to push through an unprecedented law, the Stand Your Ground Law. This piece of legislation allows citizens to use deadly force if they reasonably believe their safety is being threatened in a public place. Since then, using ALEC's model bill, the NRA and ALEC have worked in tandem to expand the legalization of this law in at least 24 states. In Florida, this legislation saw outcomes that were relatively immediate. The Tampa Bay Times reported that justifiable homicides in Florida spiked after the 2005 law from an average of 34 yearly to more than 100 in 2007. In 2012, this law was the basis of the highly controversial Florida case where Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old boy, was gunned down by George Zimmerman while walking home holding only a bag of Skittles and an Arizona iced tea. The difficulty in accessing gun data and conducting federally funded research on gun violence is also a result of the NRA's political involvement. They have ensured that legislation they support, oftentimes attached as riders to larger bills, becomes law. One of these laws that has heavily impacted the ability for lawmakers to know what the issues surrounding gun violence in their specific states is like was passed in 1996. The NRA tried to eradicate the Center for Injury Prevention and Control, a part of the CDC, but was unsuccessful. Instead of eliminating it completely, Congress compromised with NRA and passed a law that prevents the CDC from conducting any research that advocates for gun control. The director of the Injury Prevention and Control Unit at the time of this law's passing, Mark Rosenberg, said, "This was really a warning shot. The center's funding was then reduced by $2.5 million, the exact amount the CDC had used to fund a gun research study that the NRA strongly disliked." A 2003 amendment created a barrier to releasing data that is vital to researchers. It stops the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives from sharing information about gun stores that have records of selling firearms that wind up in crime scenes. This makes it absurdly challenging for law enforcement to know which gun dealers are continuing to sell guns to criminals who are not supposed to have access to weapons. Although the NRA and politicians who supported this amendment said it was passed to protect the privacy of citizens and the livelihood of gun dealers who obey rules, researchers believe this law is causing more harm than good. Before this was made law, researchers were uncovering huge disparities in their findings. They reported that roughly 1% of all gun stores in the country accounted for more than half of the crime guns the AFT traced in the late 1990s. And in some cities, it was found that just a few stores were responsible for selling weapons recovered in 70% to 90% of all gun crimes. Without the ability to gather and share similar data today, communities are being put at risk of criminal gun-related activity that could be prevented by uncovering and shutting down gun dealers that are illegally distributing their weapons. Because the NRA is registered as a nonprofit organization, the bulk of the NRA's money comes in the form of contributions, direct donations, grants, royalty income, and advertising, much of it originating from gun industry sources. Since 2005, the gun industry and its corporate allies have given between $20 million and $52.6 million to the NRA through the NRA Ring of Freedom sponsor program. Donors include firearm companies like Midway USA, Springfield Armory Incorporated, Pierce Bullet Seal Target Systems, and Beretta USA Corporation. Other supporters from the gun industry include Cabela's, Sternberger & Co., and Smith & Wesson. The NRA also made $2.9 million, about 10% of its revenue, from selling advertising to industry companies marketing products in many of its publications in 2012. Additionally, some companies donate portions of sales directly to the NRA. With all of this money in tow, the NRA steps back and assesses what campaigns and lobbyists need NRA funding in order to continue promoting their agenda legislatively. In 1975, preparing to challenge Gerald R. Ford for the Republican nomination, Reagan wrote in Guns and Ammo magazine, "The Second Amendment is clear, or ought to be. It appears to leave little, if any, leeway for the gun control advocate." By 1980, the GOP platform proclaimed, "We believe the right of citizens to keep and bear arms must be preserved. Accordingly, we oppose federal registration of firearms." That year, the NRA gave Reagan its first ever presidential endorsement. Years later, Reagan endorsed the passage of the Brady Bill, the aforementioned law that allows the sale of guns after 3 days without a completed background check. In 2004, the National Rifle Association honored Republican Florida State Legislator Dennis Baxley with a plum endorsement, its Defender of Freedom Award. More recently, the NRA spent almost $140 million on legislative programs and public affairs. More specifically, the NRA's monies were present in the 2016 election of Donald Trump. Spending more than they ever have on any election, they spent a grand total of $36 million with 4 weeks left in the election. They spent $6.5 million on one pro-Trump ad campaign featuring a woman who spoke about using her pistol to fight off an assailant. However, the NRA's endorsement of Trump and money spent on ads did not solely focus on gun issues. Their first ad campaign had nothing to do with guns. Overall, they spent millions on Trump ads, but they spent even more money, $12 million, on ads attacking Hillary Clinton. The NRA, however, prepped for the possible election of Clinton by spending several million more on Senate races to ensure that Congress would, even if Clinton was in office, protect an individual's right to bear arms. The NRA's economic influence on legislation was clearly seen shortly after Trump's election when he repealed an Obama-era gun registration law that was implemented immediately following the Newtown, Connecticut mass shooting where 20 children and 6 adults were slaughtered inside of Sandy Hook Elementary School. The NRA's political influence does not stop between election cycles, however. They utilize lobbying as an effective means for continuing to promote their agenda. In recent years, the NRA has increased its federal lobbying spending dramatically, going from $1,815,000 in 2007 to $5,122,000 in 2017, more than a 182% increase. Their most powerful lobbyist, Marianne Hammer, is nearing her 4th decade as one of the most powerful lobbyists in the U.S., if not the most powerful. She served as the first female NRA president from 1995 to 1998 and is the reason that Florida is often the first place in which the NRA pursues specific gun rights protections. Hammer is not an elected official, but she can create policy, see it through to passage, and use government resources to achieve her aims. Her policies have heavily shaped the way that gun reform is enacted, or rather not enacted at all. Dating back to the 1980s, she crafted the first ever concealed carry statute that has since been put in place in most states. Because of her lobbying efforts, now more than 16 million Americans have concealed carry licenses. She was the creator of the first previously mentioned Stand Your Ground laws as well. She's behind a piece of legislation that punishes local officials who attempt to establish gun regulations stricter than those imposed at the state level. Officials can be fined thousands of dollars and removed from office. The breadth of Hammer's power in Florida can be seen in the ways that state employees, legislators, and the governor defer to her. She gives orders and they follow them. By taking a long-term view on politics and acting as a lobbyist rather than an elected official, she can continue presenting the same bills until they are eventually passed after those who have opposed them are out of office terms. Her political clout can be summed up by one 2012 incident. In 2012, the House Criminal Justice Subcommittee received a bill establishing that a concealed carry permit does not allow a person to bring a gun into a range of government buildings or a child care center. Within days, Hammer had sent an email to the head of the subcommittee informing her that the NRA is opposed to the bill. She continued, "Hope that it will not even be heard." The legislation was left off the voting calendar and died 2 months later.
The top 3 gun manufacturers in the United States were responsible for the production of 4.5 million out of the 11.5 million firearms produced in America in 2016. The annual firearms manufacturing and export report shows the breakdown of the 11.5 million guns manufactured. This $11.7 billion industry is dominated by 3 huge publicly traded companies: Smith & Wesson, which is a subsidiary of American Outdoor Brands Corporation, Sturm Ruger & Company, and Savage Arms, which is owned by Vista Outdoor. As corporations, these large gun manufacturers are required to file detailed annual reports with the SEC and specific information about the company, from financial statements to corporate governance and everything in between. This report is available to the public and also serves as a source of information for shareholders. These snippets can be found in the Risk Factors segment of Sturm Ruger & Company, Inc.'s 2017 report. The company believes that the lawful private ownership of firearms is guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. With literally thousands of laws being proposed at the federal, state, and local levels, if even a small percentage of these laws are enacted and they are incongruent, the company could find it difficult, expensive, or even practically impossible to comply with them. In 2005, Congress enacted the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. If the PLCAA is repealed, it could have a material adverse impact on the company. For context, the PLCAA is a law that prohibits civil liability actions from being brought or continued against manufacturers, distributors, dealers, or importers of firearms or ammunition for damages, injunctive, or other relief resulting from the misuse of their products by others. Essentially, it allows the gun industry to manufacture lethal weapons used repeatedly in mass shootings with absolutely no repercussions for the effects of putting these weapons in the marketplace. Sturm Ruger is claiming that if this law is repealed, they will be held accountable for the product they produce, which would have an adverse impact on the company. The NRA lobbied for the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. These corporations are rationalizing their opposition to gun control and spreading their opinions to shareholders. This influences stockholders, many of which are already NRA members, and spreads the idea that any type of gun legislation would be detrimental to gun manufacturers, which would be disruptive to the American economy as a whole. Gun sales peak when people fear their rights to own guns are going to be infringed or restricted. Using the quantity of background checks for gun sales as the standard, there is a significant increase in gun sales following high-profile mass shootings. Additionally, presidential views on gun control can also have significant impact on gun demand. For example, sales rose during President Obama's presidency due to fear of gun control and have dropped during President Trump's administration because of his support for the NRA. This spike in sales following high-profile incidents of gun violence give these corporations an incentive to perpetuate gun violence. They are benefiting from gun violence, so from a corporate perspective, it is in their best interest to not restrict guns or implement other measures to mitigate gun-related violence. As expected, these top 3 manufacturers donate heavily to the National Rifle Association. The top 3 manufacturers donate millions every year to the NRA's Institute for Legislative Action, and money flows from other players in the gun industry. Furthermore, the NRA is packed full with gun industry executives. When it comes to making decisions, the NRA has restrictions on members that are allowed to vote, which often leaves the 76-member board of directors, a board that includes executives from leading gun industry corporations, to do the heavy lifting. This creates a board and organization that is self-perpetuating and that it lobbies for legislation that protects these corporations, and in turn, these corporations donate and support the NRA. In addition to contributions to the National Rifle Association's Institute for Legislative Action, many of these major gun manufacturers have their own political action committees. For example, the American Outdoor Brands Corporation subsidiary, Smith & Wesson, has the Smith & Wesson Holding Corporation Political Action Committee where they make further campaign contributions. These corporations are involved in legislation and campaigns essentially on all fronts as they donate to the NRA, which donates to individual politicians, they donate to other outside political action committees, and they have their own political action committees to push money into elections. The corporate benefits of gun violence flow right into our government. All of the large gun manufacturers are putting money directly into the NRA's pocket, which, as discussed previously, goes straight into the pockets of senators and House representatives. In 2016, Sturm Ruger donated a hefty $5 million to the NRA for the specific purpose of protecting the Second Amendment. The NRA turned around and spent $3 million in advertisements attacking Hillary Clinton. In 2000, Smith & Wesson made an agreement with the federal government for gun safety reform, and the NRA launched a campaign eloquently titled The Smith & Wesson Sellout. The NRA attacked the company for supposedly caving to the anti-gun agenda and nearly put the company out of business. Fast forward 15 years, Smith & Wesson donated $1 million to the NRA, which is only one of the several contributions the company has made to the NRA in recent years in the $1 million range. Essentially, the NRA forces American gun manufacturers to comply with their agenda by threatening to crush their business. Smith & Wesson was a perfect example to keep other producers from straying. In addition to NRA contributions and individual donations, the needs of these large corporations are prioritized because they are a significant source of tax income. In 2017, American Outdoor Brands Corporation documented a $63.45 million provision for income taxes, and they are only one out of the big 3 manufacturers. Vista Outdoor and Stern Ruger are paying millions in taxes as well. These income taxes don't account for the additional federal firearms and ammunition excise tax. Overall, firearms and ammunition is a huge industry. In addition to their tax contributions, these companies play a vital role in the American economy. Many Americans view their Second Amendment right as a vital component to their freedom, as well as the American lifestyle. These corporations have a significant economic as well as cultural impact. In combination with the more than generous NRA and campaign donations, the government and individual politicians believe that protecting the successes of these corporations is in the best interest of the American economy.
In America, we refer to incidents as mass shootings when in other countries they are far more likely to be covered as terrorist attacks. The foreignization of people who commit terrorist attacks has rendered too many American people unable to recognize the seriousness and breadth of domestic terror attacks. Although it is easy to other people who commit acts of terror as foreign, unfamiliar, and dangerous, the internal issue of gun violence in America cannot be tackled without Americans admitting that there are terrorists walking our streets every day. In order to effect change, citizens must hold the NRA, corporations, gun manufacturers, lobbyists, and politicians alike accountable for the repercussions of gun violence. Otherwise, the economic interests of these beneficiaries will continue to overshadow the possibility of comprehensive gun reform.